Okay, this is all about process cost, and this is what I went over in class, but I'm going to kind of reverse the way I introduced it to see if it helps any. This is what we're shooting for. We're going to create a process cost summary. It looks like my puppy dog hopped up here and helped put in some letters. So what we're going to do is figure out how much cost we have to associate with the cost of goods manufactured. We're going to calculate the number of units that we've completed and started and sent out. And so this is part one. This is part two. After we get these two put together, we're going to calculate the equivalent units of production. And even though you may have 100,000 parts, they may be only 50% complete. So we're only going to say they have 50%, they're 50% complete. So instead of 100,000 units to calculate costs on, we're going to calculate the cost on 50,000 units because they're only half complete. And once you find the overall equivalent units of production, then you're going to find the cost per equivalent unit. And those costs will either be direct materials, and then you'll also do conversion because a lot of times materials are 100% done. So you would have 100,000, but the conversion costs are only 50% done. So you would have 50,000 as equivalent units in that case. And you add those up, and you do that for your beginning, cost incurred, and then the total cost. And then you find out how much each equivalent unit or each piece cost during that period of time. So you'll see here we end up with $3 per equivalent unit and 462. You then come down and reconcile the costs and the product transferred out and the product left in work in process. So here's your cost analysis. Your total cost accounted for here should be reconciled and be the same for the total cost accounted for after doing the equivalent unit pricing of production. So that's what we're going to show you how to do. I have this laid out in a graph or in a great big table. So all you have to do is plug and chug the numbers. But let's go up here first and kind of go through some of the information we did on Monday. That didn't work very well at all. So if you look at this, we've done the job order cost, and we found out that the job order cost is used for custom orders. It's used for orders that have different, unique products. It's very low production. You can change that product any way you want. Think about a custom-made car, and you start off with a typical Ford body, okay? But then you add this kind of engine, that kind of engine, this kind of interior. That kind of becomes a job order, right? Because you can customize it all over the place. Also, it's not standardized. The only thing that's standardized would be the body of that car. Or think of going to an auto shop, and each car has different costs associated with it, so it's unique. We're now going to look at process cost systems, and they're a little bit different. They are for operations. We look more at the cost of the process first rather than the cost of the product individually. So it's going to be repetitive operations. Think of a bottle of water. Bottles of water, can't tell one from the other. They're not unique. They're plastic filled with water and slapped with a label. How complicated is that? You know, they have a label, water, plastic, and a lid, and then they package them. Repetitive, and you can't tell one case of bottle of water from the other. They're all the same. So they're very similar. Same thing with maybe rice or maybe any product that goes through an assembly line. like products. Then a very high volume. I don't know how many bottles of water one plant can process in a day's time, but I'm sure it's considerable. And there's no flexibility. Uh, a bottle of water is a bottle of water, and it's X amount, and that's the label you use. And then finally, it's very standardized. It's very, very much the same. So now we're moving from this, I'm going to individually look at each cost, to I'm going to look at the process and throw all of the costs into the process and then figure out how much product I made. And it kind of looks like this when we did materials, when we did job order. We took the direct materials and put them into an individual job. Now we take the direct materials, direct labor, and overhead and put them into a process and gather all of that information, all of that those costs in one process, and then pull apart to figure out how much each one cost, each product costs. And that brings up to the equivalent units. And equivalent units of production, or EUP, kind of looks like this. If all of my materials go into a product up front to begin with, the minute I start production, I have 1,000 or 10,000 pieces of direct material or product, and it's 100% complete. So the units for that are 10,000 if I were to do costing. On the other hand, for my direct labor, there are 10,000 of them, but they're only 20% complete for direct labor. So if I wanted to cost them, I would say, okay, 20% of 10,000 is only 2,000. So as far as direct labor is concerned, even though I have 10,000 parts complete, I'm only going to cost 2,000 of them because that's all that's completed statistically. Same thing for overhead. We have 10,000 pieces or 10,000 products, but they're only 20% costed or complete. So when I go to look at the equivalent units, I only have 2,000. That kind of makes sense. And we're going to use what we call weighted average versus FIFO. We don't want to do FIFO. So we're kind of taking an average of everything. And let's kind of look at this a little closer now and see if I can confuse you some more. So here's a system, and remember the schematic I showed you, or the form I showed you here? It has step 1, which is, and step 2, and step 3, and should be step 4. Step, did it get 8? This one only shows 3 steps. There are really 4 steps according to this. We're going to determine the flow of the units. We're going to calculate the equivalent units of production, and we're going to compute the cost of the unit, and then we're going to assign and reconcile. And that is right here. This is 1. This is the flow, okay? These are your costs. This is your flow. This is the equivalent unit calculation. This is the cost per equivalent unit, and then this is the reconciliation of it. So this is just an overview of a factory that kind of shows you raw materials come in here, they get processed through administration, and then go out the door, go into the plant floor. They start the process, they get roasted, they get blended, they get everything they need, end up in a staging area, and then go into inventory. So you've got admin here that keep track of the costs of the product and the labor. You have the factory floor. So anything that happens out here in the factory floor is going to be cost of goods manufactured. Anything that happens in this office right here, or in the sales area over here, That's actually going to be the period cost. It won't be considered into the cost of goods manufactured. Once it passes this point, it goes into finished goods, and that becomes a different kind of cost. So any material, direct or indirect, labor, indirect or direct, or um, other types of factory expenses that are applicable to this floor, this factory floor, are going to be factory overhead, and they're going to be in the cost of goods sold or cost of goods manufactured. So just kind of a visual of where those costs end up at. Now let's look at this. These are the particulars they're giving us. They're saying our beginning work in process has 30,000 units. All the direct materials are in it, and 65% of the conversion costs are in it. So then we started 90,000, and we completed and transferred out 100,000. So that means we have 20,000 left in inventory with 100% of the materials in it, but only 25% of the conversion costs. And conversion costs are what? Okay, that's that labor, right? And that factory overhead that's been applied to them. So now we come down, and these are the costs associated with it. These are units. This is units. These are dollars. These are costs. So my beginning inventory had direct materials of 81,000 and conversion costs up here of 109,900 for a total of my beginning work in process started out with 189,900. We incurred more costs. Direct material cost 279, direct labor cost 171, factory overhead applied to 120% of the direct labor cost of 205. So total cost for what was added this period is 655,200. But we have these prior costs. So we have to look at total production costs for the work in process we have, and the units we started was $845,100. That begins. Now what are we going to do? So now we're going to determine the flow, physical flow of units. And to do that, we take our beginning work in process, 30,000 units. Notice we're using full units here. We started 90,000, so I have 120,000 units to think of. After I have completed and transferred out 100,000 units, I have an ending work in process of 20,000 units. If I add those two together, I reconciled it, right? I started and began with and started 120,000 units. I transferred out 100,000 units, and I have 20,000 units left. These are full units. But when I come to costing, then I'm going to break that down a bit differently. So if I have completed and transferred out 100,000, so they're at 100%. So as far as an equivalent unit, 100% of 100,000 is 100,000. Conversion, I converted 100,000 of them, they're done. And the ending work in process now, we're dealing with a little bit different here. We had 20,000 at 100% product or material in them. So that's worth 20,000 equivalent units of production. But the conversion only had 25% of the cost in there, or completion in there. So that's like saying, well, I have 20,000, but they're only 25% complete. So equivalently, I could say there's 5,000 units worth of costs out there, not physical, but worth of cost. So that means I have direct materials total for this period. I have 120,000 units to cost out. But when I go to conversion and add that up, I only have 105,000 because these are not complete. So that takes us to our next step, and that's computing the cost of equivalent unit. So what were my costs? Well, if I go back and find my beginning cost for my work in process, was 81,108.9. It costs incurred this period for what we started were 279 and 372, 200. Add those together. So in direct materials, I had 360,000, and in conversion, I had 485. Now I can say I'm going to divide that by the number of units that are equivalent to the production. So that was 120,000 and 105,000. So each unit, material-wise, was $3 per equivocal unit. Each unit, conversion-wise, cost was $4.62. Now let's see how true that is. Now we're going to reconcile, right? So what do we have? Again, I put it together, I tore it apart, now I'm putting it back together. Direct materials, I'm going to take 100,000, what I transferred, times $3 is 300,000. 100,000, what I transferred, times 462 is 462. I transferred out, cost of goods manufactured was 762. Now I have to look at the ending work in process. So I have 20,000 at $3 worth 60,000, and I have 5,000. Remember that was 25% of the 20,000 times 462 is 2310, and that comes to a total of 83,100. Add these two together, I come up with $845,100, which, guess what, is what we started with up here. So you have reconciled it. Now, this is a fun thing to do as long as you take it step by step. Don't get putting too many variables in here. Just do one step at a time. And remember, whether you're working with units or dollars. Units or dollars. And that is